he's sure that he's serious in anything, in time and money and she's a person you can. So that's when I was interested in this project. So now there's what the police is very distinct, and I said, listen, I got some money to put for the house, but yeah. So these are the
it's the circumstance will force us to work on ourselves.
yeah.
And there are many legal circumstances who are.
Yeah. Nonsense. But that's it.
It's the level of the untransformed humanity.
And a lot of fear,
We are part of
a lot of fear. And Sarah was telling me, I want you to use the cautionary that I say, I meditate on Sarah, I do myself, whatever I say, I hit the caution. He said, what can I do?
Sure.
I can put some money, and then I want to finish the e-commerce, it's not, something has nothing to do with myself, no? Hello.
So Mila, this is what you do. He was the one who was
okay.
go by those one.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Buy bike today.
Okay.
But if you can use the bus on Friday,
Yes.
less space.
Yes.
Less space.
He can get my telephone number and
He
if
doesn't
he
have
and he also has a number?
He doesn't need.
Okay.
Mila, this is Mila.
Hello.
She can show you one Friday if she go by bus. Just
I think it's very simple. Even he can tell the driver to stop, Yeah, the driver stops here. Even in the corner. So if he gets the address, and yeah, and to say the driver drives this way. And he said, this is the right side. So it's really evident when they come. It's very simple. Look at the name of the street.
Sri Aurobindo is commenting on the phrase mind of our mind, referred to in the Kena Upanishad. And in the chapter we are now studying, he shows how mind itself is insufficient and there has to be something greater than the human mind, which is of a divine character, which the Kena Upanishad points to. The whole chapter is laid out in a form that is convincing to the mind. Mind by itself is incapable of knowing something greater than itself. Just as an animal in whom the sense mind is developed but not rational mind can only appreciate the world through the sense mind, cannot even imagine what a rational mind would be like. The human being, having a rational mind, assumes that this is the only way to know the world. Even if it has the idea that there can be something greater, it can only ideate on what that greatness would be. It cannot know it in itself. And yet, if the mind is to participate in its own release and in the manifestation of this greater divine mind, supermind, then its participation, its acceptance of this idea, and even the conviction that it must give in to something greater is necessary. So this chapter is actually convincing us logically in the way our mind can understand that there is something greater of which it is an inferior working. And after all the discussion, he says there are two possible views of the universe. Starting with the modern science, which says matter is the beginning, or a variation of that, which is the Sankhya philosophy that says nature is all and soul is separate. And there is the other viewpoint, which is the Vedic view, which is the view of the Kena Upanishad, that there is a conscious soul which is the cause of the universe and which is also the material and substance of the universe. And Prakriti, nature, is only its force operating upon itself as its own power working on its own substance. He says either way, because these have been discussed before, either way, we still recognize that the mind in the human being is the highest current development. The mind and the man with mind is the realized terrestrial Godhead. But in both arguments, whether we take the science view and the Sankhya view or the Upanishadic view, this does not say this is all. There is something greater which mind itself points towards. There is, in fact, he says, a necessity of something greater. And then the rest of the chapter is the logical necessity and the nature of that described logically. In the portion we read last time, there was this phrase used that the secret necessity in nature presses to be delivered, it also of this supreme birth. So we had made allusion to this image of a birth. The full sentence goes like this: as matter contained life in itself, contained it as its own secret necessity and had to be delivered of that birth, and as life contained mind in itself, contained it as its own secret necessity and had to be delivered of the birth it held, so mind too contains in itself that which is beyond itself, contains it as its own secret necessity and presses to be delivered, it also, of this supreme birth. And this description of the birth we saw was extremely important. There are two references in Savitri where the similar vocabulary is used, which we can briefly look at before we discuss the full sense of it. It occurs twice. In the second one, which is in the dialogue of the god of death, he's describing how everything is a creation of matter, and Savitri's visions or dreams of something greater are all illusions. And he says, "Vain is thy longing to build heaven on earth, artificer of ideal and idea, mind, child of matter in the womb of life, to higher levels persuades his parents' steps. Inapt, they follow ill the daring guide." So it describes the relationship of mind with life and matter. Matter is the parent of mind, but how does matter reveal mind? By conceiving and forming it in the womb of life. And this mind, which is born from matter through the womb of life, tries to persuade his parents, life and matter, to follow its own higher steps, and they are incapable, and they cannot follow, they are inapt, they fail. They're not suited for mind's daring climb of ideal and idea. But here, matter and life are made the parents. Matter is the father, life the mother, who through the womb gives birth to mind. And there's a very subtle suggestion there of the relationship of these three. You find similarly in the biblical tradition the appearance of Eve out of Adam, as it is translated after many degrees of translation. It is described as Eve produced from the rib of Adam, but the original word is will in the Hebrew tradition and before. It is the Adam as the conscious being from its will manifests nature, power of consciousness to give form. And therefore, the womb is in nature. It is through the means of nature to cast into form that evolution can proceed. But it is the will behind of the consciousness which directs, conceives, and forms through the womb of nature. There's another reference to the same kind of an idea, but now more free. That was on page 615 for those who are interested. This is on page 43, where Ashwapati is experiencing the nature of this reality, the relationship of spirit and matter. And the line goes, "The world was a conception and a birth of spirit in matter into living forms. And nature bore the immortal in her womb, that she might climb through him to eternal life." And so this gives you a picture which is much more revealed. Spirit conceives and takes birth in matter, and through the birth, it expresses itself in living forms. The means of that birth is nature, bearing in her womb. But who is it that she bears? The immortal himself. Why does she do that? What is her dream through giving birth to the immortal? That through him she can climb to her own origin, which is the immortal life. And so the human soul is as if nature's child, whom she nurtures to help him awaken gradually to mind and through mind to still greater possibilities of consciousness. As the human being evolves, nature herself in him and through him rises to her own fulfillment. So these two images give us a deep sense of this idea of the birth. If we dwell on the sense of birth, there is always a seed which contains the full potential of the birth already held in essential form, in essence but not in form. The process in the womb is for the essence to gradually take on form. But the womb is necessary because the form is still unstable. It is still fragile. It is still not sufficiently formed to be able to relate on its own to the world. And so the womb provides the protective, nourishing environment. Even it provides the material out of which the form is made. The seed was essential. It did not have in itself the material, but it had the means to organize material. It had the vision of how to organize the material, and it had the intention which it infused into the material. But it needed still this passage through the womb until the material takes on sufficient form to become reasonably independent. And then it is put out, separated from the womb into birth. Now, if you observe the nature of this process, in how life emerged out of matter and how mind emerged out of life, we get a hint of how this divine mind, supermind, will emerge out of mind. You see the substance of matter upon which there is the brooding consciousness, shaping, forming until the form can separate and become independent and operate as material substance filled with life, with intention, and with a self-sustaining character, capable even of persisting, reproducing itself. In the same way, the mind principle was already there in the life instinct, but in the life, the mind goes through a process of formation until eventually it can emerge into its own, and then suddenly we see in certain developed animals an ability to, as if, think, even if the thinking is at first instinctive. And then that emerges until thought in itself becomes its own purpose. In the human being, thought is a satisfaction in itself. Even if our body is crippled and we are unable to move, the power to think is a satisfaction. And we value it so much, we take pains to transmit that capacity or develop it in our children. Unlike life, which only provides material nourishment for its children, suckling the child, feeding it until the body becomes sufficiently strong to sustain life, mind does not provide only material nourishment, it provides psychological nourishment. We transmit the maximum of our own mental capacity and knowledge into children, and that is the nourishment we give. But a similar process emerging from mind to supermind will involve something essential within mind gradually forming itself, becoming more and more complete, and once it is sufficiently ready, asserting itself directly in the mental processes and eventually breaking free and existing as a separate experience from the mind process. Something which will be so complete in itself that it will not depend on mind process even. Such a power of consciousness would also therefore transmit itself in all beings around it. The human being not only influences the human child, but also influences the animals. When we have a dog as a pet, we try to train the dog to do things, to respond to human commands, to enter into activities which are more essentially human than natural to the dog's instinct. The dog enjoys it because it feels the sense of growth through this infusion of mind into its sense mind. In the same way, the spiritually realized being transmits the radiance of that consciousness in those around him to the extent they are ready to receive, to the extent that they're capable of receiving, and in this way infuses into nature the push of something which was not there before, triggering even as a seed the fertilization and the awakening of more such beings in the environment. So this is the sense that we get from this image that Sri Aurobindo uses of a birth. Mind too contains in itself that which is beyond itself, contains it as its own secret necessity and presses to be delivered, it also, of this supreme birth. But this birth is supreme because it completes the evolutionary ascent. But there is a necessity which presses. And earlier in the paragraph, Sri Aurobindo described the three forms in which it presses: secret tendency in our mind, secret aspiration, and secret necessity of our nature. And this is what Sri Aurobindo will now elaborate to show us how, in the very limitation of the mind and its instinct, is the push to the characteristics of supermind. So Sri Aurobindo first gives a logical step. What is the rational necessity which forbids us to suppose mind to be nature's last birth and compels us to posit something beyond it, of which itself is the indication? So we could say nature's last birth is mind. And we could make it an article of belief, article of faith, as they say in religion. But if you think about it, logically you can say that's a wrong conclusion. So what is the rational necessity which says that mind cannot be the last? What is the necessity which forces us to assume there is something beyond mind, of which mind is an indication? And so for that we have to study the nature of mind. He says, a consideration of the nature and working of mentality supplies us with the answer. For mentality is composed of three principal elements: thought, will, and sensation. If you think about the nature of our mentality, you can compare it with the animal to contrast. You will see that in the animal also there is will. In the plant also there is sensation. The will in the plant is less obvious. We see the will in the persistence of the plant to continue to grow in spite of every opposition. But in the animal, the will is instantly responsive, so it's more obvious. Sensation developed in plant continues through animal into human mind, but in animal, the will has emerged, and then in the human, the thought. So what describes the human being completely is thought, will, and sensation. Even if the will and sensation were developed before, they have taken on a new form in humanity because of the power of thought. So the nature of human will is very different from animal will. Animal will may be merely to survive, to fulfill the drive of its instinct. Human will wants to create things which it can conceive with thought, which do not exist and which do not belong to its current instincts of survival. And so the nature of human will, as also the nature of human sensation, are of a different order already. They are already mentalized. Human sensation, unlike plant or animal, is not satisfied with mere comfort and discomfort. It is also creative. When we prepare food, we want to vary the taste of the food, to push limits and to create tastes that do not yet exist, to surprise, to stimulate the mind, and to make possible something which would seem to be impossible, not only in taste, but in appearance, in form. And this is the nature of our technological experience. So, the three principal elements, thought, will, and sensation, in the human being form the nature and working of mentality. And so, from the perspective of mentality, how would we describe these three? How would you define them? And Sri Aurobindo gives a pithy definition of each, which goes back to first principles, and then he elaborates on how these point to something greater. Sensation may be described as an attempt of divided consciousness to seize upon its object and enjoy it. Thought, as its attempt, it means divided consciousness. So thought as its attempt to seize upon the truth of the object and possess it. Will, as its attempt of divided consciousness, to seize upon the potentiality of the object and use it. Now, these three things, seen from this perspective, everything becomes immediately clear and obvious. All three attempts are failing. There is not in mind to be able to, the capacity to be able to fulfill perfectly these attempts. Therefore, they point to something greater in which they could be fulfilled completely. But the attempt itself are of three types. The attempt itself carries in it a conviction that a fulfillment is possible. And it can have that conviction because there is actually that possibility waiting above mind. So let's view these three in greater detail. He says, first, sensation. This may be described as an attempt of divided consciousness to seize upon its object and enjoy it. So consider that sensation cannot be experienced unless there are two separate objects. You have to reach out to have sensation of something else. Sensation of your own awareness does not make sense. You have awareness, but it does not carry, obviously, the nature of sensation. You have awareness of your own awareness. I'm aware that I'm happy. I'm aware that I'm sad. But sensation requires something else, against which there is a contact. And so, sensation itself emerges from the precondition of a divided consciousness. And when there is division, one piece registers the existence of another piece. And that registration is sensation. But the moment there is registration of sensation, the registration itself reaches out to register more, until eventually it tries to register entirely the other object. So there is an attempt to seize upon its object. And throughout each step of the increasing registrations, there is a sense of newness, of discovery, of going beyond one's limitations, of enjoyment. So a child opens its eyes, sees a form, a rattle that shakes and makes a noise, and immediately the sight locks on this strange object with a strange color, making a strange noise, and its hearing and all the five senses tune in. If possible, the child will grasp it, press it, break it, chew it, smell it, as if trying to absorb what the object is into itself to know it completely. Now, notice the intention, the effort itself, the impulse in us is to take in and assimilate. But of course, we are unable to. Whatever sensation gives, that is all that we are able to take, but there is something missing. In its most intense form, when the sensation is very strong and very pleasurable, very enjoyable, we want as if to reach out and eat up. You see, in nature, Sri Aurobindo observes, the first expression of love is in the attempt to absorb the other, to eat the other and assimilate into oneself. And we see this among certain very low forms of insects and creatures. Even in the human being, there is a tendency to want to absorb the other. But the instinct is wanting a complete absorption, assimilation through sensation, and with it, complete enjoyment. Because the starting point was divided consciousness. But now what happens? The very act of the separation is a barrier. You have to cross a gulf, and by the time you're able to cross, your senses have already lost something. You smell food which is close to your mouth, the smell is strong. It is stronger when it is inside your mouth. We call it flavor. But when it is outside and farther away, you have only a brief whiff, not the completeness of the enjoyment when it is inside your mouth. And the same thing with sight. I see something far away, vaguely, it looks interesting, and that's why I want to go close so that I can have a more complete visual experience, and so on. The gap which separates diminishes, reduces the capacity of the senses. But even when we reduce the physical gap, eat the food, still, the food itself, as long as it remains separate, the full knowledge of it, the full identification with it is incomplete. When the food is taken into the stomach and digested, and there is a complete assimilation, the food is no more separate. So as long as you have separateness, there is incompleteness. If there has to be completeness, then the other has to be destroyed. So this is a very strange limitation of material sensation. Next, he describes thought as the attempt of divided consciousness to seize upon the truth of the object and possess it. So you see, behind the sensation was this attempt to fully know, but the sensation can only know form. What is the continent of the object? I know what you look like, I don't know what you think. I don't know who you are. I take an apple, I know what it smells like, tastes like, but what is the apple really? With a human being, it's obvious that there is a person there. With the apple, you do not know the person as obviously. If the apple could respond and talk back to you through its change of color, through sounds, through smells, then you would recognize that there is actually a consciousness inhabiting, which is aware. And to know it, you would still have to go through the senses. With a human being, because you can interact, you recognize immediately there is a consciousness. You cut through the senses or use the senses to get to know the person. Tell me something about yourself. What kind of a person are you? What do you think? What do you like? And so on. And I'm trying to get an awareness of the thing in itself which is not expressed in the five senses. So thought is attempt of divided consciousness to seize upon the truth of the object. And the truth is something abstract, essential, not expressed, not put in form, unknowable therefore by the senses. And if I want to seize upon the truth of the object, what is the completion of the seizing? Possess it. It becomes mine, it becomes a part of me. And the third, will. will as its attempt, the attempt of divided consciousness, to seize upon the potentiality of the object and use it. So I see the apple. I see the potential in this apple. Of course, I can eat it, enjoy it, get nourished. But I can also see the potential of decoration in the eating experience. I can cut it into pieces, arrange it to make it beautiful, and then enjoy it more completely with my visual experience as much as with the olfactory or the taste buds. The crunch of the apple satisfies my hearing also. So I will try to modify this, draw out from it a potential which I sense to make it more and more completely expressive. I see a large number of metal pieces fallen. Immediately, the mind recognizes there is an essential truth in those pieces. They all represent a dismantled bicycle. And what does the will in me want to do? The bicycle is the potentiality of those pieces. Bring them together, assemble it, and make a bicycle that I can use. Or someone has constructed a bicycle. I see it in the shop. I want to have it. Because with this, I can actualize a potential that exists to be able to roll effortlessly great distances with just a push of my leg. So everywhere, our will wants to act when it senses something possible which is not yet, and it wants to catch that possibility and use that possibility. Sometimes the possibility is created by the thought. The thought conceiving in the mind's senses, I see, I visualize a certain object which is not yet existent on the earth, and my will immediately wants to seize upon that potentiality and use it, for which then I begin to act, to assemble objects, make things, and make material what was before only a mental construction. So these three things are also deeply interconnected. Each of them supports the other two. And the three woven together makes for a normal nature of working mentality. But you see, in all three, we have seen insufficiency. Because we cannot possess completely, because we cannot use completely, because we cannot enjoy completely, there is always some gap between our ideal conception and the physical form. You will see the experience that children have, even we have all had as children. We had a wonderful visualization of something which could be made, and in the mind's image it seemed so easy. And then we began to gather materials to put it together, and it was so inconvenient, so unnatural. At each step there was a barrier, something not working. Most easily, this difficulty is seen if you want to draw a picture. You see a beautiful flower, take a pencil and paper and try to draw it. And you see how difficult it is. The pencil is insufficient, the hand is insufficient, the coordination of eye and hand is insufficient. But in your mind, you can visualize the perfect picture you want to draw. So there is a sense of something perfect conceived, which I could fully enjoy, which I could fully possess and fully use, and yet in the actual implementation it fails. So Sri Aurobindo continues, at least these three things are such an attempt in their essentiality, in their instinct, in their subconscious purpose. But obviously the attempt is imperfect in its conditions and its success. Its very terms indicate a barrier, a gulf, an incapacity. So somebody could argue, mind is not these three things. It is, and we could make a whole list. It is ability to rationalize, it is the ability to create, to visualize, to communicate, and so on. Yes, mind is all those things also. But what is the essence of everything that the mind does? in their essentiality, in their instinct, in all these activities of mind, you will find these three things as the subconscious purpose. Why do I want to have a logical conclusion? Because I see a possibility and I want to now be able to seize it. I want to know the truth of it and I want to be able to enjoy it. And therefore the logical working of the mind happens. Why do I want to be creative? Because I sense there can be something more. I want to be able to enjoy that and possess that and give form to that. So always in all activities of mind, you will find the essential instinct, often subconscious purpose behind the obvious purposes are these three things. But then he says, obviously, the attempt is imperfect in its conditions and its success. The conditions of our life, of course, make these three things to be complete. They make them very difficult to be complete. But he says its very terms indicate a barrier, a gulf, and incapacity. So the terms are what? In the way we have articulated it, the term of the sensation, attempt of divided consciousness to seize upon its object and enjoy it, means there is a gulf, a barrier preventing it, and so an attempt has to be made. In the attempt, there is a gulf to be crossed to the barrier itself, which is separating, and as a result, a failure, incapacity, not able to go fully into the other. Similarly, the thought attempting to seize upon the truth of the object and possess it, it means my thought does not have the truth already. And when it reaches out to seize the truth and possess, the truth somehow escapes the grasp. I'm able to catch aspects of it, perspectives of it, but I'm not able to fully experience that truth because my thought itself can only engage partially. And the will senses a potential, wants to seize the potential and use it, but it fails because the will is incapable of fully actualizing what it wants to do. At each step, there is a resistance, and a resistance to be overcome. In the very act of overcoming the resistance, I have put further conditions which limit other possibilities. So you notice how technology works. To make a technological masterpiece, whether it is construction of a bicycle, a car, a mobile phone, a rocket, a light bulb, whatever it is you've created, to make that stable, working, lasting, there is so much fine-tuning and precision involved. And final product is something so precisely made that now it becomes difficult to modify. We have as if to narrow down and limit the capacity into a narrow specialization to make it stable, and then we lose flexibility. Or we keep flexibility, it can do many things, but it is unstable. And so somehow in the very act of putting into matter, fulfilling in matter, something fails, and eventually the will is incapable. And Sri Aurobindo now gives the big picture, why this happens. As life is limited and hampered by the conditions of its synthesis with matter, so mind is limited and hampered by the conditions of its synthesis in life. So when life had to enter matter to have a material life, there had to be a kind of a synthesis, a joining between the two. That matter could become living and life could become material. When that synthesis took place, there were certain conditions. Matter itself has to retain its character of resilience to make for stable forms for life. The very act of retaining its resistance now weakens life form. Life form eventually fails to push against this resistance and begins to age and give up and die. On the other side, when life engages with matter, it wants to persist. Matter accepts that plasticity, that persistence, that movement, that activity. And life has to force matter to do something unnatural, to keep on moving, to keep on changing until it begins to break. A molecule of metal kept stable will stay as long as it wants. You keep bending it, eventually it breaks. So the body of life moving continuously in activity, even when we are sleeping, everything is moving. Our lungs are breathing, our heart is beating, blood is flowing. Within the cells, the full regeneration is going on. Our so-called sleep and rest is only activity modified with a different focus. Life has to remain active constantly, and that wears out matter, which is incapable of that kind of activity. So from both sides, there is a compulsion on the other, which wears out the other, and an eventual failure takes place. The same thing happens when mind engages with life. So mind is limited and hampered by the conditions of its synthesis with life in matter. So now into this life matter synthesis, mind has entered and added a third dimension of synthesis, compelling life to compromise with mind and matter to compromise with mind. And so the compromise has become even more extreme. This is the reason why in nature you'll find life forms which are not too mental have far greater strength, energy, sometimes even youth capacities which mind loses when it engages and compels a further compromise. So with mind, the mind now drives life. Life instinctively knows how to heal itself. Life in the animal, when the animal is tired, goes to rest. When the animal is sick, life pushes the animal to eat certain foods to get healed. But when mind comes in, mind does not listen to the instinct of life. Instead, it imposes upon it its ideas. I want to do this, even though I'm tired. I feel ill, but I don't trust my instinct. I rather trust my science and my medical knowledge, which is probably mostly wrong, or when it is right, it is partial, or it is too generalized and does not fit my specific case and need of the moment. But I would rather follow that and impose that on the body, and the body has to struggle against the imposed ideas of the mind which break its natural rhythm of the life and its healing and growth processes. On the other hand, the physical matter is also put under greater stress by thought. So, for thought to be able to fully act in the biology itself has to become more and more refined to engage with the thought. So, first, matter had accepted with life to have movement, but with thought, it has to have a finer, refined sensitivity which pushes the limit of materiality towards mind. And then matter suddenly becomes more delicate. It cannot have its denseness and rigidity anymore. It tends to become fragile. You will see from the ape to the human, the loss of strength, the loss of physical strength as a result. But even the tissue in the human is as if more refined, more conscious. And that consciousness, the pressure of the mind's activity on the biological substance itself, tends to fragment it if the mind is agitated and chaotic. So when our thoughts are negative, disturbed, and chaotic, the physical vibration of molecules and atoms becomes also agitated, disturbed, and chaotic. And the bonding of matter itself is as if weakened. From the other side, matter and life are also compelling mind to reduce. Matter forces on mind the need for unconsciousness. During sleep, this is most obvious, but during our so called waking state also, our mind actually is enormously dulled and made unconscious. So much so that at the time of release from the body, there is a great sense of decompression and expansion. And often, when we are out of the body in this way, we say, do I really want to go to that dulling, dense effect? We feel this when, often as a result of some deep experience or high state of consciousness in meditation, we feel so light, so free, so uplifted and wide. And after that, after a nap, suddenly we find ourselves dulled. Everything is lost. We don't feel, we don't experience those things anymore. And the contrast is so sharp. So sharp that if we stay in that dullness long enough, we even forget what it was like to be wide, free, and light. And the memory that we felt wide, free, and light is all that remains, not the experience of the memory. And so we can even wonder, was it an imagination? Was it a hallucination? I can't even feel what it was like. I just remember thinking that it was light, free, and wide. But I don't remember what is that experience of lightness or freedom or wideness. So matter has dulled mind. And the capacities of mind, which are far more than our current intellectual capability, all those have been dulled into this, which Sri Aurobindo calls the physical mind. And in the physical mind, the access to things of the mental world has been locked out. And we feel as if our mind itself is identified with the body tissue and even a product of the body. So this is the compromise matter has imposed on mind. But life force also has imposed a compromise on mind for this synthesis. And life force has reduced mind's free floating exploration of reality and the truth of reality to sensory objects. Mind cannot think of beautiful, idealistic things anymore. It is forced to serve the instincts and the desires and needs of life. So you see, the mass of humanity uses the intellect only to fulfill the moment's desire, pleasure, or survival needs. Yes, in the process of serving survival needs, we have created complex devices which distinguish us from the animal. But all those devices are only intended to drive survival needs and pleasure needs. Mind in itself rarely is able to separate and free into those higher domains of thought, of knowledge, philosophy, and seeking for truth of things to understand and to know. And where in those individuals this aspect has been sufficiently developed, you find the life energy weakens. They are often frail in their health. So the professor of philosophy is a daydreamer. He's impractical. He's not engaged with the sensory world experience. He is absent-minded, and often the form of the body itself is weak, frail. So in each case, there has been greater and greater compromise. Of course, the result of all that compromise is this extraordinary thinking, living, material body. So as life is limited and hampered by the conditions of its synthesis with matter, so mind is limited and hampered by the conditions of its synthesis with life in matter. Neither matter nor life has found anything proper to their own formula which could help to conquer or sufficiently expand its limitations. They have been compelled each to call in a new principle, matter to call into itself life, life to call into itself mind. So when matter was insufficient, unable to express its full potentiality, it called in life to be able to express that, and you had living matter and forms growing. Life, when it found itself unable to deal with complex situations, it needed mind to be able to organize life and push to its greater possibilities. Mind also is not able to find anything proper to its own formula which can conquer or sufficiently expand the limitations imposed upon its workings. Mind also has to call in a new principle beyond itself, freer than itself, and more powerful. Mind is freer than life, but there is something still freer. Mind is more powerful than life, but there's something even more powerful. But how do we know that will be the last? Maybe that principle is weak also and will need to call something else. Is there ever an end to this whole chain of calling in something more? And this Sri Aurobindo explains in the next paragraph. We could say, for argument's sake, that yes, there are many levels. But each of these levels corresponds to some creative power in the universe which has formed mind, life, and matter. There is such a thing as a first creative power, out of which all these creative expressions of manifestations have emerged. And so, yes, we can say there is an ultimate power above mind which can overcome all these limitations of mind, of life, and of matter. But what happens now? Observe how mind is not able to find anything proper to its own formula which can conquer or sufficiently expand the limitations imposed upon its workings. These limitations of life, energy, and matter are imposed. Mind feels even a kind of a suffocation from these limitations. And it has tried to apply its proper formula. What is mind's nature of thinking, of imagining, of creating, organizing, making perfect? All of these things it has applied on itself, on life, on matter. When it first began to apply them, it said, here, I will solve all the problems. I will make life perfect. I will make the material world a paradise. This was the promise of science. But having taken it far enough, we find with each new invention which could have improved things, something emerges which subverts. And it emerges even from within mind, from its compromise with life. While mind is idealistic, life focuses on self-preservation, accumulation to protect its survival needs, denial of the other, conquest of the other in order to assert its own dominion. And this being mixed into mind, all the great beautiful inventions which mind created to improve material life have been subverted by the life instinct for domination, for destruction, misused. And so each step to bring in the paradise has only worsened and made more complicated and created even a kind of a contrary hell at the same time as the possibility of the paradise. And when mind tries to overcome that instinct of life, it finds it is unable. And so, eventually, mind says, I will organize, compel life by force. So we create all the laws, we create all the systems of governance to prevent misuse and misapplication. The result is, the same mind now which is now trying to impose on life its new rule, the same mind finds ways to subvert its own laws. And it discovers very quickly that whatever rule you make has an exception, and there's always a gap in which you can now create ambiguity, and from that ambiguity leverage to have the opposite result. So you find whenever the government creates a law, at first it seems everything is fine, and then people find ways to get around the law. And then after a while, there is so much misuse that you create another law on top of the first. And you have so many layers eventually that the whole thing becomes a suffocation, and you have to break them and rewrite to match the new situation and the new mindset values. But after all of this has been attempted, we realize there is no way out because of the nature of reality, which is not rational. Reality not being rational, the mind with its rationality is unable to organize life and reality to make it utopian. And so finally the mind says logic fails, and the modern age breaks down. There is a postmodern age, and so on, in which mind says logic is not enough. We need to follow something else which is spontaneous, which is automatic, which knows truly. And this is really the nature of the description next. But we discover there are two kinds of knowing truly. There is a knowing truly in darkness, instinctive, and a knowing truly in awareness, which is what we want, but somehow is not yet fully accessible. So in the next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo says, in other words, mind does not exhaust the possibilities of consciousness and therefore cannot be its last and highest expression. Mind tries to arrive at truth and succeeds only in touching it imperfectly with a veil between. There must be in the nature of things a faculty or principle which sees the truth unveiled, an eternal faculty of knowledge which corresponds to the eternal facts of the truth. Similarly, he says, mind labors to effect the will in it and succeeds only in accomplishing partially. There must be a faculty or principle of conscious effective force which corresponds to the unconscious automatic principle of self-fulfillment in nature. And this principle must be sought for in the form of consciousness which exceeds mind. Mind finally aspires to seize and enjoy the essential delight-giving quality, the rasa of things. But it succeeds only in attaining in it indirectly. There must be a principle which can attain directly, hold rightly, enjoy intimately and securely. There is, says the Veda. So I've very quickly summarized the next paragraph by reading a few fragments, but this is the broad line of the discussion now. These same things, thought, will, and sensation, and what they're attempting which fails, can be realized by a consciousness which is greater. And in what way? And what is the relation of our current thought, will, and sensation with the way that consciousness operates these three things? That is what we will take up in detail next Sunday. See, in this study, the mind gradually, through its own thinking and irrational process, is convinced that there is something greater. And when it is convinced that there is something greater which can accomplish what it has failed to do, it begins to have a hope. And when the mind can hope, it can begin to work in that direction. It can begin to consciously develop that capacity, that consciousness, and even to consciously open to and invoke it in itself. And that would be the first step of the birth that mind has to give to this consciousness beyond itself. In the act of studying this text, Sri Aurobindo is planting the seed of that birth in our mind. Our mind, our life, our body then becomes like the womb, in which this seed now fertilizes and begins to form the new consciousness, which Sri Aurobindo has described as the mind of light, which is the passage through which our physical mind can begin to open to a higher light, and through that passage ascend and arise into that higher consciousness, which is the truth consciousness, the supermind. But it takes place in us. We are the womb. Our mind and our capacity is the womb, but the womb has to nourish the seed. So these ideas we must hold in ourselves, brood upon them, nourish them, turn more and more of our consciousness and the highest part of us towards the seed, and give it the material substance needed to begin to form the mind of light. And in this way, gradually, the seed grows and takes a more and more distinctive form. You will recall from our study of the chapters on the mind of light from Sri Aurobindo's last few articles. He says the mind of light forms in two stages. At the first stage, it assembles the material and forms only a basic framework, not sufficiently distinct from the rest of the mind's processes. But once it comes into its own, it can break free and emerge in itself as the mind of light, still not fully developed, but a distinct functioning of the mind of light. And then from there it develops to its full potentiality. That would be the transition of the birth. Right now, the first stage in the womb is beginning to take place. And if we participate consciously, it can take place more directly and more rapidly. And if we open to Sri Aurobindo and his inspiration and his light, then he can implant in us more and more directly and speed up that process of the formation of the new consciousness. And so we study this text with that intention. We can meditate on this briefly for 2 minutes.